Two tiny German Shepherd puppies were curled beside a frozen shed door in the Wyoming snow, their small bodies trembling after a night that should have taken their lives. Someone had left them there in the storm, alone in the cold. When former Navy SEAL Ethan Walker stepped outside to grab his snow shovel, he stopped the moment he saw them. Ethan had fought wars most people would never see, and after losing his K9 partner Titan during a brutal winter rescue, he believed his purpose was gone.
You're okay.
But as he lifted the two freezing puppies into his arms, something inside him came back to life. Because sometimes the lives we rescue are the ones sent to rescue us. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from today. Drop your country in the comments below. Jackson Hole, Wyoming, lay under the kind of winter silence that did not feel peaceful so much as absolute, as if the mountains had drawn a white curtain over every road, every roof, every fence line, and decided that for one more morning, the world below would belong only to snow, wind, and memory. The storm that had passed in the night had buried the valley in fresh drifts that glowed pale under a hard gray sky. And the town itself, usually scattered with the small signs of ordinary life, pickup tracks, chimney smoke, distant plows grinding against frozen streets, now seemed far away from the cabin tucked near the pine woods at the northern edge of the ridge, where the cold held longer and the wind came down with enough force to rattle windows, creep beneath doorframes, and make even seasoned men feel as though winter were not weather at all, but a presence standing just outside, waiting to be acknowledged. That cabin belonged to Ethan Walker, 39 years old, former U.S. Navy SEAL, a man built like someone who had spent most of his life carrying weight without complaint, broad through the shoulders, compact and hard through the torso, tall enough to fill a doorway and quiet enough to make a room feel smaller rather than louder. Even alone in the mountains, he moved with disciplined control, wearing his full Navy working uniform, Type 3 in the green, AOR-2 digital camouflage he had never quite stopped trusting, the long-sleeve blouse fitted over a powerful frame, matching trousers tucked into brown combat boots. The fabric softened by years of use, but still worn with the same unconscious precision that once belonged to deployments and briefing rooms. His face was stern and angular, weathered by cold and time, with steel blue eyes that seemed to hold more restraint than rest, a short ash-brown beard touched by faint gray, and the kind of stillness that often made strangers think he was calm, when in truth he was simply practiced at hiding what most men would have let spill long ago. 2 years earlier, he had not come to Jackson Hole because he loved solitude in any romantic sense, nor because he believed mountain air could heal what war and loss had carved into him, but because after enough funerals, enough hospitals, enough polite conversations with people who meant well and understood nothing, he had needed a place where silence did not ask questions. At the center of that silence lived one wound deeper than the others, and that wound had a name: Titan, his K9 partner, a working-line German Shepherd with a deep sable black coat, intelligent amber eyes, scarred ears, and a patient, battle-tested steadiness that had once made Ethan trust the animal more than most human beings, until pneumonia took Titan after a winter search and rescue mission in conditions so brutal that the dog had kept working long after his lungs had begun to fail. And Ethan, though no one blamed him, had never forgiven himself for bringing his partner home alive from war, only to lose him afterward to cold exhaustion and breath that slowly stopped answering the body's demand to survive. The morning after the storm, Ethan woke before dawn, as he always did, though he had hardly slept, and moved through the cabin by habit rather than thought, feeding the fire until the cedar crackled back to life, checking the latch, studying the windows, gauging the depth of the snow piled against the porch and rail. The weather report on the radio had spoken of cleared skies and falling temperatures, which in Jackson Hole often meant the storm had finished the visible part of its work and now left behind the harder labor, digging out paths, clearing roofs, checking lines, making sure the cold did not finish what the wind had started. So when the first ash-blue light spread over the ridge, Ethan reached for his gloves and decided to go to the storage shed behind the cabin for the snow shovel and the blower attachment he kept under a tarp, already planning the order of the day in his head, because routines, unlike thoughts, did not betray him. He stepped outside, and the cold hit him with the kind of clean violence mountain winters specialized in, sharp enough to sting the lungs and tighten the skin around his eyes, while the snow beneath his boots gave a dry, heavy crunch that echoed across the yard and disappeared into the pines. The shed stood 30 feet behind the cabin near the tree line, its roof bowed under white weight, its wooden sides darkened by years of storms, and the narrow path leading to it had vanished completely, forcing Ethan to push through knee-deep drifts while spindrift blew in low sheets across the ground like smoke from some frozen fire. There was no movement anywhere, no bird, no truck on the road below, no sound except wind brushing through fir branches and the muted groan of the world settling under winter, and for a few moments he felt that familiar emptiness return, the one that always came hardest after storms, when the landscape became so stripped down that a man had nowhere to hide from himself. By the time he reached the shed, his gloves were dusted white, and his beard carried a fine crust of frost, and he leaned forward to pull at the swollen door, which resisted at first, before yielding with a long wooden scrape that sounded louder than it should have in the morning stillness. He had opened it only halfway when something at the base of the wall caught his eye. Something small and uneven in the shadow where the wind had driven snow against the corner, and his body went still before his mind had fully understood what he was seeing. Because there, on the narrow strip of boards just outside the threshold, pressed into the angle where the shed met the cabin fence, were 2 German Shepherd puppies no more than 5 weeks old, huddled so tightly together they seemed at first like one broken shape of fur and ice, their tiny bodies curled inward with the instinctive desperation of abandoned things, trying to make themselves smaller than the cold. The larger of the 2 was a male, black and tan beneath the frost, his oversized paws tucked under his chest, his ears still too soft to stand, but already shaped with the promise of the shepherd he might become if life gave him that chance, while the smaller pup, likely female, was lighter in color with a pale gold wash through her coat and a narrower muzzle darkened by wet cold, and she lay half under her brother's neck as though he had tried all night to shield her from the wind with the only warmth he had. Both were trembling, though the tremor in the smaller one was faint and irregular, the kind that frightened more than constant movement, because it suggested the body was beginning to surrender. And when a gust slid through the gap in the open shed door, the male pup flinched weakly and pressed himself harder into the corner, but the smaller one did not even lift her head, her lashes silvered with frost, her breathing so shallow that Ethan had to kneel to be sure it was there at all. For one suspended moment the mountains, the shed, the snow packed into the seams of his boots, all of it fell away behind a memory he had never managed to outrun. And in that memory, Titan had lain on a steel veterinary table under harsh fluorescent light, chest lifting in short labored pulls, eyes still alert even while the body was failing. And Ethan had stood there powerless in a way combat had never made him feel. Because bullets could be answered, terrain could be read, commands could be given. But the sound of a partner struggling for air and trusting you anyway was the kind of helplessness that kept returning in dreams long after a mission ended. Now, staring at those 2 puppies wedged against frozen wood as if the world had pushed them to its edge and forgotten them there, he felt the old grief move through him, not like a blade this time, but like something thawing painfully under ice, and with it came the first stir of purpose he had felt in months, raw and instinctive, the same refusal he had once carried into gunfire when something living needed him, not to hesitate. He took off one glove and reached toward the larger pup slowly, letting the animal see the movement, letting his voice come low and steady the way it used to when calming young handlers, frightened civilians, or Titan after nightmares born from sounds even dogs could remember, and the little male answered with a weak attempt at a growl that dissolved into a rasping whine before his chin sank again onto the boards. Ethan touched the pup's side and felt how little heat remained, then slid his hand beneath both bodies and found them shockingly light, all bone, damp fur, and failing warmth. Yet the instant he lifted them, they pressed together harder, the smaller one giving a faint twitch against his wrist, while the male tried, even now, to angle himself protectively between his sister and whatever threat he believed the world still was. That tiny gesture, stubborn and loyal in the face of deathly cold, hit Ethan with such force that he had to draw one slow breath through clenched teeth, because it was the kind of courage he knew too well, small only in size, never in meaning. He gathered them fully into his arms and tucked them against his chest beneath the open edge of his uniform blouse, using his own body heat the way instinct told him to. And the change was immediate enough to break something open inside him, because the larger pup let out a thin sound that was not quite fear and not quite relief, while the smaller one, still barely conscious, made the weakest movement of all by shifting her muzzle against the fabric over his heart, as though some buried animal knowledge had recognized shelter before her mind could. Snow blew into the shed behind him, the shovel and the machine forgotten where they were. And Ethan rose without another thought for the work he had come out to do, turned from the white yard, and began the walk back to the cabin with the two puppies held close, his arms careful, his jaw set, his heartbeat heavy and unfamiliar in his own ears, because he understood, even before he allowed himself to put it into words, that the morning had changed in a way no weather could explain. When he stepped back through the cabin door, warmth met him in a low wave of cedar smoke and firelight, and for the first time in a long while, the small house did not feel like a place built only to hold one man and his ghosts, but like a threshold something fragile had crossed and might yet survive beyond. Ethan kicked the door shut behind him, looked down at the two freezing puppies trembling against his chest, and stood motionless for a breath that seemed to gather the past and the future into the same narrow space, because he had gone out intending only to clear snow, to resume another winter day, identical to the one before it. Yet now he knew with the blunt certainty that had once guided him in combat that this was no ordinary rescue, no passing act of mercy to be forgotten by nightfall, but the first small decision in a life that had already begun, quietly and without permission, to turn toward something living again. Morning settled slowly over Jackson Hole after the storm, the pale winter sun rising behind a wall of distant peaks and spilling a muted silver light across the valley, as if the mountains themselves were still deciding whether the day deserved warmth. The snow remained deep and untouched beyond the narrow circle Ethan Walker had cleared around his cabin. The world outside quiet, except for the occasional whisper of wind through the pine branches and the distant crack of ice shifting along the frozen Snake River, somewhere beyond the ridge. And inside the small wooden cabin the air carried the steady smell of cedar smoke and damp wool as Ethan knelt beside the fire with the two German Shepherd puppies wrapped carefully in an old flannel blanket, watching their tiny bodies tremble in uneven rhythms that told him they were still fighting the cold but had not yet surrendered to it. Ethan moved with the quiet discipline of a man whose hands had once stabilized bleeding soldiers under worse conditions than this, though the situation now was gentler and yet strangely more personal, because the larger pup, black and tan with oversized paws and the stubborn shape of a shepherd already visible in the line of his muzzle, had begun to lift his head weakly whenever Ethan adjusted the blanket, while the smaller female with the pale golden coat remained mostly still except for shallow breaths that fogged faintly in the warm air near the fire. And Ethan, crouched there in his Navy working uniform Type 3, with the sleeves pushed slightly back and the faint scars of old missions visible along his forearms, found himself murmuring small reassurances in the same calm voice he once used with Titan during long nights of search operations, as if the words alone could hold life in fragile bodies that had almost slipped beyond saving. He had already cleaned the frost from their fur using a towel warmed near the hearth and placed a shallow bowl of lukewarm water nearby, though neither pup had yet managed more than a few weak licks, and the silence of the cabin was so complete that he could hear the faint ticking of melting ice from the edges of their paws, a delicate sound that seemed impossibly small against the weight of the mountains outside. And yet for Ethan it carried a quiet urgency, because he recognized the signs of animals hovering between exhaustion and survival. That thin border where warmth, patience, and a bit of stubborn luck sometimes tipped the balance back toward life. Around mid-morning, a sound broke the stillness, not the wind or shifting snow, but the low growl of an aging pickup engine climbing slowly along the narrow road that curved past Ethan's property before disappearing deeper into the pines. And though the sound was distant, it carried easily across the frozen valley, prompting Ethan to glance toward the window with the instinctive alertness of someone trained to register movement even after years away from active service. Yet the truck did not stop at his cabin, but continued toward the neighboring property about 300 meters down the slope, where a smaller cabin sat partly hidden among spruce trees. A place that had remained empty most of the winter until a few weeks ago when new lights began appearing in the evenings, and smoke once again rose from its chimney. The new resident of that cabin was Emily Carter, 28 years old, a recently hired elementary school teacher who had moved to Jackson Hole from Boise after accepting a position at the small town's only primary school, a woman whose presence in the valley had already become known to a few locals, not because she sought attention, but because her personality carried a natural openness that softened the reserve common in mountain towns. Emily was of average height, with a slender build shaped more by long walks and outdoor habits than by deliberate exercise. Her chestnut brown hair usually pulled back into a loose braid that escaped its tie whenever the wind picked up, and her hazel eyes held a brightness that suggested curiosity rather than caution, a quality that had helped her connect easily with children, but sometimes left her slightly out of place among adults who had lived in Jackson Hole long enough to treat strangers with polite distance. That morning, Emily had been on her way back from the small town store after picking up supplies when she noticed smoke rising from Ethan's chimney earlier than usual, and faint tracks in the snow leading toward his shed. And though she had only spoken to him briefly once before, when introducing herself as the new neighbor, she remembered his quiet politeness and the tired expression behind his steady eyes. The kind of look she had seen before in veterans who visited the school during community events, men who carried something heavier than simple fatigue. And as she stepped out of her truck, she noticed something unusual near the path between their properties. Tiny paw prints scattered unevenly across the snow, as though two small animals had struggled to move through the drifts before disappearing toward Ethan's cabin. Curiosity mixed with concern led her to follow those faint tracks, her boots crunching softly across the frozen ground, while the cold air reddened her cheeks. And when she reached the cabin porch, she hesitated briefly before knocking, the sound echoing lightly against the wooden walls. Inside, Ethan heard the knock and rose slowly, glancing once more at the two pups before opening the door. And when it swung inward, Emily found herself facing the tall figure of the former SEAL, framed by the warm glow of firelight behind him, his presence calm but imposing in the way of someone accustomed to command, yet unwilling to impose it. And for a brief moment, both of them simply studied one another with the quiet curiosity of neighbors still learning the outlines of unfamiliar lives. Emily spoke first, her voice gentle but energetic in a way that seemed to carry warmth even in the cold air, explaining that she had seen the tracks and wondered if something had happened. And when Ethan stepped aside to let her in, she immediately noticed the small bundle near the hearth, where two trembling shapes moved beneath the blanket. She knelt instinctively beside them, the movement quick but careful, and her expression softened with immediate understanding as she recognized the puppy's condition, because Emily Carter had grown up on a small ranch outside Boise, where injured animals were treated with practical compassion rather than hesitation. And though she had left that life years ago to pursue teaching, the instinct to help fragile creatures had never quite faded. Within minutes, she was moving about the cabin with the easy efficiency of someone used to small emergencies, unpacking a canvas bag she had brought from the truck that contained several items she often kept for stray animals around town: powdered puppy milk, a small bottle for feeding, antiseptic wipes, and a pair of thick cotton cloths that could be warmed by the fire. Ethan watched quietly as she worked, noticing how her movements carried confidence without arrogance, how she spoke softly to the pups as if they could understand reassurance even before their bodies regained strength. And for the first time since bringing them inside, he felt the burden of doing everything alone begin to lift slightly, replaced by the unexpected comfort of shared attention focused on two small lives that refused to fade. The larger pup responded first when Emily dipped a fingertip into warm milk and let a droplet touch his tongue, the tiny shepherd instinctively licking before lifting his head weakly, while the smaller female remained fragile but showed a faint twitch when Emily wrapped her more tightly in one of the warmed cloths. Ethan knelt beside them again, studying the animals with the careful observation he once reserved for trained K-9 partners, and after a moment he spoke quietly, almost to himself, saying that if they were going to survive, they would need names, because names made survival feel less temporary. And Emily smiled at that thought before asking what he had in mind. Ethan studied the male first, noticing the stubborn angle of his ears and the determined way the pup kept nudging closer to his sister even while exhausted, and he finally nodded once and said the name Ranger, because the dog already carried the spirit of a guardian who would watch over others despite his small size. Then he looked down at the pale female whose breathing had grown steadier beneath the blanket and chose the name Scout, a name that felt fitting for a creature who might someday move quietly ahead of danger the way Titan once had. And as the two names settled into the room, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere, as if the act of naming had anchored the puppies firmly into the world of the living. Emily remained for nearly an hour helping stabilize the pups, feeding them small drops of milk and adjusting the blanket while the fire burned steadily beside them. And during that time, she spoke a little about herself, how she had accepted the teaching job, hoping for a quieter life, away from crowded cities. How the move had been harder than expected because she knew almost no one in town yet, and how the long winter evenings sometimes made the cabin feel lonelier than she admitted to her colleagues. Ethan listened more than he spoke, offering only brief answers when asked about the valley or the road conditions. Yet the conversation carried a comfortable rhythm that felt unexpectedly natural for two people who had met only days earlier. By the time Emily finally prepared to leave, the transformation in the puppies was already visible, Ranger lifting his head more frequently, while Scout's breathing had deepened into a steadier rhythm. And Ethan walked her to the door with a quiet nod of gratitude that needed no elaborate words. Outside, the snow had begun to soften under weak sunlight, and Emily paused on the porch long enough to glance back through the open doorway at the scene inside. The tall veteran kneeling beside the hearth, two fragile puppies wrapped in blankets at his side. And something about the image made her smile gently before she turned and headed back toward her cabin. Inside the house, Ethan returned to the fire and watched Ranger and Scout settle into deeper sleep, their small bodies no longer trembling as violently as before. And he realized that the silence of the cabin had changed again, no longer heavy with isolation, but filled instead with the quiet presence of fragile life and the faint echo of a neighbor's kindness. He adjusted the blanket around the puppies and leaned back against the wooden wall, his gaze drifting toward the window where winter sunlight now reflected across the endless snowfield. And for the first time since Titan's death, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps the emptiness he had carried for 2 years did not have to remain permanent. Winter in Jackson Hole did not leave quickly, and even after the storm that had nearly taken 2 small lives faded into memory, the valley still lived beneath a pale ceiling of cloud and cold light, the snowfields stretching across the foothills like a quiet ocean that had forgotten movement, while Ethan Walker's cabin stood at the edge of the pine forest where wind carved slow patterns through powder drifts and the smoke from his chimney drifted straight into the gray sky. Inside that cabin, the atmosphere had changed in ways subtle but undeniable, because where there had once been only the quiet discipline of a man living alone, there were now 2 growing German shepherd puppies who had begun to claim the space with restless curiosity, their small paws leaving scattered prints across the wooden floor, while the fire crackled steadily in the stone hearth as though welcoming the return of something warmer than survival. Ranger was the first to regain strength, his black and tan coat now clean and soft beneath the winter light, his oversized paws thumping clumsily against the floorboards as he explored corners of the cabin with the determined enthusiasm that often belonged to working-line shepherds bred for intelligence and endurance. Though only a few weeks old, he already carried the posture of a dog that wanted to understand the world rather than fear it, lifting his head whenever Ethan moved, ears twitching in early awareness of sound and command, while Scout remained smaller and lighter in color with her pale golden coat and delicate build, moving more carefully as though the cold had left a lingering memory in her bones. Yet her pale amber eyes followed Ethan constantly with quiet devotion, the kind of watchfulness that spoke less of courage than trust. Ethan noticed the difference between them within days, and the soldier in him responded almost instinctively, because structure had always been the language through which he understood chaos. So even inside a quiet mountain cabin, he began introducing the simplest forms of discipline that had once guided both men and dogs in the field. He started with basic commands delivered in a calm, steady tone. Sit, stay, come, never raising his voice, never repeating himself unnecessarily. And though the puppies barely understood the sounds at first, Ranger responded quickly to the rhythm of instruction, while Scout observed carefully before imitating her brother, as if studying the meaning behind every movement before committing herself to action. Outside, the snow remained deep enough to swallow careless steps. Yet Ethan cleared a narrow training path beside the cabin where the 2 pups could follow him through shallow drills that resembled miniature versions of exercises once used with military K-9 units. He would whistle softly and hide a glove beneath the snow a few feet away, then step back while Ranger sniffed eagerly through the powder until he found the scent and pawed at the hidden object with clumsy pride, while Scout approached more cautiously, but eventually succeeded through patience rather than speed. And as the days passed, Ethan began to realize that both dogs possessed instincts unusually sharp even for shepherds their age, their noses lifting to test the wind whenever unfamiliar sounds traveled through the trees. Those small routines might have seemed ordinary to anyone watching from outside, but for Ethan, they stirred memories he had spent 2 years trying not to revisit, because the rhythm of training, the quiet commands, the focused observation, the careful praise given only when earned, belonged to a life he had once shared with Titan, the German shepherd who had served beside him during search operations in mountains and deserts alike. Titan had been larger and darker than Ranger, his sable coat thick against cold weather, his amber eyes alert, with a calm intelligence that sometimes made Ethan feel the dog understood his thoughts before words were spoken. And though Ethan rarely allowed nostalgia to linger, the sight of 2 young shepherds learning the language of discipline brought Titan back into memory with painful clarity. One evening, as the sky darkened early over the valley and the snow reflected a dull blue glow beneath the rising moon, Emily Carter arrived at Ethan's cabin carrying a small basket covered by a folded cloth, her boots brushing loose snow from the porch before she knocked lightly on the door. She had come several times since the rescue, each visit bringing something simple but thoughtful. fresh bread, jars of homemade soup, or small supplies for the puppies. And with each visit, the initial awkwardness between neighbors had softened into a quiet familiarity that neither of them openly acknowledged, yet both seemed grateful for. Emily stepped inside with the same gentle energy that always accompanied her presence, her chestnut hair escaping from its braid after the wind caught it during the walk from her cabin, and she greeted the puppies first with a warm laugh when Ranger bounded clumsily toward her boots, while Scout followed more carefully, her tail wagging in small uncertain movements. Emily crouched beside them, scratching gently behind Ranger's ears while examining Scout's thinner frame with the practical attention of someone who had grown up around animals. And Ethan watched from the kitchen counter while pouring coffee into 2 mugs, noticing how naturally she fit into the quiet life of the cabin, despite arriving as a stranger only weeks earlier. Emily Carter was not someone who spoke loudly or demanded attention, yet her warmth filled rooms in ways that made people feel less alone without understanding why. She had spent most of her childhood helping her parents run a modest ranch outside Boise, where long winters taught patience and responsibility early. And though she had chosen teaching because she believed children deserved encouragement in a world that too often ignored them, the move to Jackson Hole had not been easy, leaving behind family and familiar places for a small town where friendships formed slowly and winters stretched longer than expected. That evening she unpacked the basket she had brought, revealing a small pan of cornbread and a container of vegetable stew she had prepared after school, explaining with a slightly embarrassed smile that cooking for one person often produced more food than she needed. Ethan accepted the meal with quiet gratitude and set the dishes on the table while Ranger and Scout curled near the fire again, their growing bodies now strong enough to sleep without trembling, and for a while the conversation moved easily through simple topics. School children, weather reports, the slow rhythm of life in a mountain town where even small events carried weight. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward the dogs themselves, and Emily asked how Ethan had known how to care for them so effectively in those first desperate hours, because most people would have panicked or waited for help rather than acting so quickly. Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering, leaning back slightly in his chair while watching the firelight reflect across the wooden walls. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the steady restraint of someone revealing a memory he had carried alone for too long. He told her about Titan then, about the German Shepherd who had served as his K-9 partner during multiple deployments and rescue missions, describing the dog not with sentimental exaggeration, but with the respect soldiers reserved for comrades who had earned their place beside them. Titan had been trained for tracking and search operations, capable of navigating terrain where human senses failed, and together they had pulled lost hikers from snowstorms and located survivors after disasters where seconds mattered more than comfort. The story slowed when Ethan reached the end of Titan's life, because the memory remained sharp despite the years that had passed. He explained how the dog had fallen ill during a winter search for a missing climber trapped somewhere in the mountains beyond Jackson Hole, how the storm that night had been worse than expected, and how Titan had kept working long after the cold began tightening his chest until pneumonia took hold days later, leaving Ethan with the quiet belief that if he had called the mission sooner, if he had ordered them back before the weather turned brutal, his partner might still be alive. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression gentle but thoughtful, and when Ethan finally finished, she did not offer easy reassurances or arguments against his guilt, because she understood that some wounds did not respond to logic. Instead, she simply said that Titan had sounded like the kind of dog who chose loyalty over comfort, and that such loyalty often came from love rather than obedience, a thought that lingered in the room long after the words were spoken. The fire burned lower as the evening deepened, and Ranger eventually lifted his head from the blanket to rest his muzzle against Ethan's boot, while Scout curled closer beside him, their breathing slow and steady, as if the quiet conversation itself had reassured them. Ethan looked down at the two young shepherds, noticing how naturally they had claimed their place near him. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes rather than stopping halfway, as it had for years. Emily noticed that change as well, though she pretended not to draw attention to it, choosing instead to tell a story about one of her students at school who had tried to teach the classroom goldfish how to follow commands using pieces of cracker as rewards. The story was simple and slightly ridiculous, yet Ethan laughed softly at the image, the sound surprising even him because laughter had been rare in the cabin until the arrival of two freezing puppies and a neighbor who refused to treat silence as permanent. When Emily finally stood to leave, the night outside had grown still again, the snow reflecting faint moonlight across the valley while the pine trees cast long shadows over the frozen ground. She paused at the door to pull on her gloves and glanced once more toward Ranger and Scout sleeping near the hearth. And something in her expression suggested quiet satisfaction, as though the small lives she had helped save were already fulfilling a purpose larger than anyone expected. After she left, Ethan returned to the fire and sat down beside the two pups, letting the warmth of the room settle around him, while the memories of Titan drifted through his thoughts, not with the same sharp pain as before, but with a softer understanding that time sometimes reshaped grief without erasing it. Ranger stirred in his sleep and pressed closer to Ethan's leg, while Scout shifted her head against the blanket, and the steady rhythm of their breathing filled the cabin with a calm presence that felt less like responsibility and more like belonging. For the first time since Titan's death, Ethan did not feel as though the past had stolen his future entirely, because somewhere between training commands, shared meals, and quiet evenings beside the fire, two young shepherds and a determined schoolteacher had begun opening the door to a life that looked different from the one he had lost, yet not empty in the way he once feared. Winter had never truly loosened its grip on Jackson Hole, but in late February the mountains developed a strange habit of pretending to soften before reminding everyone how unforgiving they could still be. And on that particular afternoon, the sky above the valley carried the uneasy stillness that seasoned locals recognized as the quiet before a second storm. The clouds had thickened into a low gray ceiling that flattened the light across the snowfields, while the wind shifted direction through the pines with a restless whisper that suggested the weather gathering beyond the ridge had not yet decided whether to arrive gently or with force. And Ethan Walker, who had spent enough years reading terrain and atmosphere during missions in hostile landscapes, noticed the signs immediately as he walked the narrow forest trail behind his cabin with Ranger and Scout moving through the powder beside him. The two German shepherd pups had grown stronger over the past weeks, their bodies still young but already carrying the instincts that marked them as working-line shepherds rather than ordinary house dogs. Ranger, the larger male with the dark saddle across his back and bright amber eyes, moved confidently through the snow with an eager curiosity that made him dart ahead whenever Ethan whistled softly, while Scout, smaller and lighter in color, with her pale golden coat and careful intelligence, stayed closer to Ethan's side as though measuring the world before committing herself to it. And together they created a quiet rhythm along the forest path that had become part of Ethan's daily routine as he inspected the trail markers that ran between his cabin and the lower ridge leading toward town. Ethan had developed the habit of checking those trails not only out of practicality, but because movement through the forest kept his mind focused, replacing the old military patterns of patrol with something quieter yet still purposeful. He carried a short field stick in one hand and wore his familiar Navy working uniform Type 3 beneath a thick winter jacket, the green AOR2 camouflage blending almost naturally into the muted colors of the pines. And as he paused occasionally to examine broken branches or shifting drifts, he gave Ranger and Scout short commands that reinforced the discipline he had begun teaching them. Simple whistles for recall, a hand signal to stay, a quiet command to search, each instruction delivered calmly, as if the forest itself were part of their training ground. The air began to change as the afternoon deepened, the wind rising in uneven gusts that lifted loose snow into thin spirals across the clearing. And Ethan glanced toward the western ridge, where darker clouds had gathered in a dense wall that swallowed the pale sunlight behind it. He knew the pattern well enough to recognize the warning. Another storm building quickly across the mountains. Yet he estimated there was still time to return to the cabin before conditions worsened, so he gave a short whistle to call the dogs closer and turned back toward the narrow trail that curved through the spruce trees toward home. Miles away, along the county road that connected the small Jackson Hole schoolhouse to the outer cabins scattered across the valley, Emily Carter was finishing the long drive home after another quiet day of teaching children who had already begun counting the weeks until spring. Her pickup truck, an older blue Ford that rattled faintly whenever the engine climbed steep grades, had carried her safely along the snowy roads since the start of winter, though the approaching storm had already begun dusting fresh powder across the asphalt. And Emily leaned forward slightly over the steering wheel while watching the road with careful attention, her hazel eyes reflecting the shifting gray sky beyond the windshield. Emily Carter had always driven cautiously in winter conditions, a habit formed during childhood on her family's ranch, where icy roads demanded patience more than confidence. Yet even experience could not control everything the mountains decided to do. The wind strengthened suddenly along the narrow stretch of road that cut through open meadow before reaching the pine forest near her cabin. And a sheet of loose snow swept across the asphalt, just as her tires passed over a patch of ice hidden beneath the powder, causing the truck to slide sideways in a slow, helpless arc that carried it off the road and into a shallow snowbank along the tree line. The impact was not violent, but it was enough to bury the rear wheels deep into the drift, and Emily exhaled slowly while gripping the steering wheel, steadying herself before trying the ignition again. The engine started without trouble, yet when she pressed the accelerator, the tires spun uselessly against packed snow, the vehicle shifting only a few inches before settling deeper into the bank. And after several careful attempts, she finally turned off the engine to conserve fuel while reaching for her phone, only to discover what she had already half expected. The signal had vanished beneath the thickening storm clouds rolling across the valley. Back near the forest trail behind Ethan's cabin, Ranger stopped suddenly in the snow, his head lifting sharply while his ears tilted toward the distant wind as though catching a scent or sound beyond the ordinary rhythms of the woods. Scout paused beside him, her pale coat blending almost perfectly with the drifting snow while she studied her brother's posture with alert curiosity. And Ethan noticed the shift immediately because dogs trained even lightly in search instincts rarely changed behavior without reason. Ranger gave a short, uneasy bark, then began pacing in tight circles with his nose lifted toward the wind, while Scout trotted toward the direction of the road before glancing back toward Ethan as if urging him to notice something he could not yet perceive. The behavior was different from the playful curiosity they usually display during training exercises, carrying instead a focused urgency that reminded Ethan of the early signals Titan once gave when detecting a distant human scent during rescue missions. Ethan crouched slightly in the snow, watching the dogs with the quiet attention he had learned during years of working beside trained K-9 partners. And after a moment, he spoke softly to them while scanning the forest edge where the trail descended toward the road beyond the trees. The wind carried only fragments of sound through the rising storm, yet Ranger's agitation continued to grow, his paws digging restlessly into the powder, while Scout gave a low whine that seemed almost like a question. Inside Ethan's mind, an old instinct stirred, the recognition that dogs sometimes sensed distress long before humans could identify its source, and though logic suggested nothing more than the approaching storm, the memory of Titan's uncanny ability to detect distant trouble returned strongly enough that Ethan decided not to ignore the warning. He stood slowly and brushed snow from his gloves before giving the dogs a short release command, the same tone he used during training exercises that allowed them to follow scent trails beyond his immediate control. Ranger responded first, launching forward through the snow with his nose low and tail level, while Scout followed closely behind, her smaller body moving with surprising determination as the two shepherds began weaving between the trees along the slope, leading toward the county road. Ethan watched them disappear briefly among the pines before moving after them at a steady pace, his long stride carrying him quickly through the drifting snow while the wind began to rise sharply across the valley. By the time he reached the lower edge of the forest, the storm had begun in earnest, thick flakes sweeping sideways through the air and blurring the distant outlines of the road beyond the trees. Yet Ranger's barking carried clearly through the wind now, sharp and insistent, as he circled a patch of snow near the roadside, where Scout had already begun pawing excitedly at something hidden beyond Ethan's view. When Ethan emerged from the tree line, he immediately saw the blue pickup truck tilted at an angle in the snowbank, its rear wheels half buried beneath fresh powder, while the driver's door remained closed against the growing storm. And for a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow to the single realization that the dogs had found someone in trouble long before he had even known to look. The storm that had begun as a distant warning across the Wyoming sky now arrived in full force over Jackson Hole, the wind pushing thick curtains of snow through the forest in restless waves, while the fading afternoon light dissolved into a gray blur that swallowed shapes and distances alike. Ethan Walker moved through the drifting snow with steady determination behind the two young German shepherds who had already slipped ahead between the pines, their dark bodies weaving through the white landscape like small shadows with purpose. And though Ranger was still little more than a growing pup, he carried himself with the same focused urgency Ethan had once seen in fully trained search dogs, his nose low to the ground while Scout followed a few paces behind, her smaller frame moving carefully, yet persistently, as if she understood that speed alone would not guide them through the rising storm. The forest path had nearly vanished beneath fresh snowfall, yet Ranger continued forward with confident bursts of motion, pausing occasionally to test the wind before plunging deeper between the trees, while Scout maintained a steady rhythm behind him, her ears flicking toward every sound as if measuring the world for danger. Ethan followed their tracks with long strides, the green AOR2 camouflage of his Navy working uniform hidden beneath a thick winter jacket dusted white by the storm. And though the cold wind clawed against his face, he kept his attention fixed on the dogs ahead because their behavior carried the unmistakable signal of a scent trail worth following. Ranger barked once when the road finally appeared beyond the tree line, the sound cutting through the storm with sharp clarity as he circled a patch of snow near the roadside, while Scout rushed forward to paw anxiously at the drift that had partially swallowed the blue pickup truck resting at an awkward angle against the bank. The vehicle looked smaller under the accumulating snow, its rear wheels buried deep while frost had begun to lace across the windows, and for a moment Ethan felt the same focused calm he once carried into dangerous situations overseas. The quiet understanding that panic solved nothing and that action, measured and deliberate, was the only path forward. He moved quickly toward the driver's door, brushing thick snow from the handle, while Ranger barked again near the hood as if urging him to hurry. And through the frosted glass, Ethan could see Emily Carter slumped slightly in the seat, with her coat pulled tight around her shoulders, her head resting against the side window where condensation had formed in faint patches of breath that proved she was still alive. The sight tightened something in Ethan's chest, not from fear, but from urgency, because he knew too well how quickly cold could turn exhaustion into hypothermia in conditions like these. Emily Carter, though usually energetic and resilient, now appeared pale beneath the weak interior light of the truck, her hazel eyes half closed, while her chest rose in slow, uneven breaths that fogged the glass beside her cheek. And when Ethan knocked sharply on the window, her eyelids fluttered open with delayed recognition before she attempted to move toward the door. Her movements were sluggish, the result of cold creeping through layers of clothing, and Ethan realized immediately that forcing the door open from outside would be faster than waiting for her to unlock it. He stepped back slightly and used the handle of his field stick to strike the frozen edge of the window until the brittle ice cracked along the seam, then reached inside to release the lock before pulling the door open against the wind. The storm pushed a swirl of snow into the truck's interior as he leaned inside and spoke calmly to Emily, his voice steady and deliberate as though guiding someone through the fog of shock, while Ranger circled anxiously near the tires and Scout remained close to Ethan's legs as if guarding the space behind him. Emily tried to speak, but her voice emerged only as a faint rasp, carried away by the wind, and when Ethan helped her shift toward the open door, he felt how cold her hands had become, even through her gloves. He wrapped one arm firmly around her shoulders and guided her out of the vehicle, lifting most of her weight as she struggled to keep her footing in the deep snow while the storm continued thickening across the valley, the wind now strong enough to blur the outlines of the forest behind them. For a moment, Ethan considered attempting the return to the cabin immediately, but the path through the woods had already begun disappearing beneath the storm, and Emily's condition made a long walk dangerous, so he scanned the nearby forest edge for shelter while Ranger and Scout watched him with alert intensity. Years of survival training returned quickly to his mind, reminding him that sometimes staying in place with warmth and protection was safer than pushing blindly through worsening weather. He led Emily a short distance into the trees, where the wind weakened slightly among the trunks, then cleared a small space beside a fallen log where the ground remained partially sheltered beneath thick branches. From the pack he carried during trail checks, he pulled a compact emergency tarp and a small metal fire kit, items he kept out of habit rather than expectation, and within minutes he had stretched the tarp between two low branches to create a crude windbreak before kneeling to build a small fire using dry twigs hidden beneath the snow. The flames grew slowly at first, thin orange tongues licking at the wood before strengthening into steady heat that pushed back the worst of the cold air, and Ethan helped Emily sit against the fallen log while wrapping his own jacket around her shoulders to preserve warmth. Ranger immediately moved close to her side, his young body pressing gently against her legs, while Scout curled beside him, their combined warmth forming a small barrier between Emily and the freezing ground. Emily's breathing gradually steadied as the fire brightened, though her voice remained weak when she finally managed to thank Ethan for finding her, and he simply nodded in response, while adjusting the firewood with careful movements that kept the flames alive without wasting fuel. Around them, the storm roared through the forest canopy, yet the small shelter beneath the tarp created a fragile island of warmth where the glow of firelight reflected across the snow in soft, flickering shapes. Ranger lifted his head occasionally to scan the surrounding woods, his ears twitching toward distant sounds as if standing guard over the quiet clearing, while Scout rested her muzzle against Emily's knee in calm loyalty, her pale coat catching the firelight like a small flame within the darkness. Watching them both, Ethan felt a strange mixture of pride and disbelief settle in his chest, because the two dogs he had once carried, half frozen into his cabin, were now the reason he had found Emily before the storm could claim her. For a long moment he sat beside the fire, studying the dogs with thoughtful silence, remembering the fragile bundle of fur they had been only weeks earlier, and the way Ranger had refused to leave Scout's side even while nearly frozen himself, and the realization struck him with quiet clarity that the small lives he had saved had already begun returning that gift to the world in ways no training alone could explain. As the wind howled through the forest beyond their shelter and the fire crackled steadily between them, Ethan rested one gloved hand briefly against Ranger's head and then against Scout's warm back, his voice low when he spoke the thought aloud for the first time since finding them on that frozen morning. "Looks like you two decided to become rescuers yourselves." The storm that had once threatened to bury the valley eventually loosened its grip on Jackson Hole, the way winter always did in the mountains. slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the cold itself needed time to accept that the season of silence was ending. The snow that had piled across the forests and roads through months of bitter wind began to soften under the longer daylight of March. And by early April, the hills surrounding Ethan Walker's cabin showed the first narrow lines of thaw where dark soil and stubborn patches of grass broke through the white, while the distant Snake River, once sealed beneath thick ice, started to murmur again with the low, restless sound of moving water returning to life. Emily Carter recovered gradually during those late winter weeks, her strength returning day by day after the night she had nearly frozen in the truck beside the forest road. And although the doctor in Jackson Hole insisted she remain cautious for a while longer, the worst of the danger had passed once Ethan guided her safely back to the cabin, and the warmth of the fire slowly chased the cold from her body. She had always been resilient in the quiet, determined way common to people raised in rural places where hardship was treated less as tragedy and more as an obstacle to be worked through patiently. Yet that night in the storm had left a quiet impression on her, not of fear, but of realization, the understanding that survival sometimes depended on the unexpected loyalty of those who refused to leave when the world turned harsh. Through the remaining weeks of winter, she visited Ethan's cabin often, sometimes bringing soup or bread from her kitchen, sometimes arriving with nothing more than conversation after long days teaching children whose energy could exhaust even the most patient teacher. And during those evenings, the cabin that had once felt like a solitary outpost slowly transformed into a place where laughter returned in small, cautious pieces. Ranger and Scout, who had once been fragile bundles of fur wrapped beside the fire, now moved through the house with growing confidence, their paws larger, their coats thicker, and their instincts sharper with each passing day. Ranger developed first into the stronger of the two, his black and tan coat darkening along the back, while his amber eyes carried the alert intelligence of a working dog, who seemed always ready to respond to the smallest signal from Ethan. And though he still possessed the occasional clumsy enthusiasm of youth, his loyalty had already settled deeply into his behavior as he followed Ethan across the yard or through the forest with the quiet focus of a companion who understood his place beside the man who had saved him. Scout, lighter in color and slightly smaller in frame, carried a different kind of strength, her pale golden coat catching sunlight like soft flame, while her careful intelligence made her observe situations before reacting. And when she finally acted, it was often with surprising accuracy, as though she had learned to trust her instincts only after measuring the world around her. Spring arrived fully by late April, bringing with it the return of green along the valley floor and the bright sound of birds that had vanished during the deepest weeks of winter. And with the change in season, Ethan Walker found himself thinking differently about the future than he had at any time since leaving the Navy. For 2 years after Titan's death, he had believed his purpose had ended with the loss of the partner who once shared every mission beside him. Yet watching Ranger and Scout grow into confident young shepherds stirred a quiet realization that purpose could be rebuilt rather than replaced. That realization took shape one afternoon when Ethan drove into town and stopped at the small general store where most of the valley's residents gathered for supplies and conversation, a place run by a man named Daniel Brooks, a broad-shouldered storekeeper in his early 50s with weathered skin and a thick gray beard that made him look older than he truly was. Daniel had lived in Jackson Hole nearly his entire life and carried the calm patience of someone who understood the rhythms of mountain towns. And when Ethan mentioned the increasing number of stray animals occasionally abandoned along the remote roads outside the valley, Daniel nodded with quiet concern because he had seen the same problem growing over the years. It was during that conversation that Ethan first spoke aloud an idea that had been forming quietly in his mind, the possibility of creating a small rescue effort for animals left behind in the wilderness, something informal at first, but organized enough that people in town would know where to call if they discovered a stray dog or injured animal during winter storms. Daniel listened carefully before agreeing to help spread the word through the store's bulletin board and local community board near the post office, and by the time Ethan left town that afternoon, he carried the first fragile outlines of what would soon become a volunteer rescue network across the Jackson Hole Valley. Emily became part of that effort almost immediately, not out of obligation, but because the idea aligned naturally with the values she already carried into her classroom each day. She believed children learned empathy most easily through caring for living things, and after speaking with Ethan, she began organizing small educational talks at the school where students could learn about responsible treatment of animals, how to recognize when a pet needed help, and why abandonment in harsh climates often meant certain death for creatures unable to survive alone. The children responded with surprising enthusiasm, and within weeks several teachers joined Emily in helping organize the program, including a quiet art instructor named Laura Bennett, a tall woman in her early 30s with soft brown hair and thoughtful gray eyes who had moved to Jackson Hole after leaving a stressful city career in graphic design. Laura's calm personality balanced Emily's energetic warmth, and together they created lessons that encouraged students to see animals not as disposable property, but as living companions deserving respect. During those same weeks, Ranger and Scout matured rapidly under Ethan's steady training, learning more complex commands and developing the kind of discipline that allowed them to assist in small search tasks around the valley when local hikers occasionally reported lost pets or injured wildlife near the forest trails. Ethan never pushed them beyond their age or strength, yet their instincts made the work feel less like training and more like the natural extension of loyalty already rooted in their bond with him. By the time summer approached, the rescue effort had quietly expanded beyond what Ethan had originally imagined, with townspeople volunteering small amounts of time or supplies whenever a call came through the community board, and the cabin near the pine forest slowly became known as a place where abandoned animals might find safety until proper homes could be arranged. Ranger and Scout were often the first to notice arriving visitors, their alert barks echoing through the trees before Ethan even stepped outside to greet whoever had come. One afternoon in early June, when the mountains glowed green beneath clear sunlight and the air carried the warm scent of pine and river water, Ethan sat on the wooden steps of his cabin, watching Ranger and Scout run across the meadow below the porch, their coats shining beneath the afternoon light as they chased each other through tall grass that had only weeks earlier been buried beneath winter snow. The valley looked entirely different now, alive with movement and color where silence once ruled. Scout eventually trotted back first, settling near Ethan's boots with the quiet loyalty she had always shown, while Ranger remained a few yards away, sniffing the breeze before bounding toward the porch with the playful energy that still surfaced despite his growing discipline. Ethan rested one hand on Ranger's head and another on Scout's back, feeling the steady warmth of two dogs whose lives had begun on the edge of freezing death only months earlier. A moment later, Emily Carter appeared along the narrow path leading from her cabin, walking easily through the meadow with a small basket balanced in one arm, the sunlight catching the loose strands of her chestnut hair as she approached. When she reached the porch, she lifted the cloth covering the basket to reveal a freshly baked apple pie, whose scent drifted warmly into the summer air. "Thought you might like something better than trail rations today," she said with a smile that carried both humor and quiet affection. Ethan accepted the pie with a grateful nod before glancing down at Ranger and Scout resting beside him, and for a moment he remained silent while studying the two dogs who had entered his life during the coldest night of winter. "You know," he said finally, his voice softer than usual, "I sometimes think Titan had something to do with sending these two." Emily did not answer immediately, but her smile deepened as she looked at the shepherds stretched comfortably at Ethan's feet. "That sounds exactly like something a loyal partner would do," she replied. Ethan leaned back slightly against the porch railing while the warm sunlight spread across the valley below, and for the first time in years, he noticed that the quiet surrounding him no longer felt like emptiness, but like peace. The kind that came not from isolation, but from knowing the life he carried forward had meaning again. Sometimes the miracles that change a life do not arrive with thunder or bright light from the sky. They arrive quietly in the middle of an ordinary winter morning in the shape of two small lives that need someone to care enough not to walk away. In Ethan Walker's story, the miracle did not begin when the storm ended, and it did not begin when the rescue was successful. It began in the moment a tired man who believed his purpose was over chose kindness instead of indifference. When Ethan carried two freezing puppies into his cabin, he believed he was saving them, but what he did not realize was that God was already working through that moment to save him as well. Many times in our lives, we think the chapters that hurt us are the end of the story. We lose someone we love. We carry guilt that never seems to leave. We feel alone in ways we cannot explain to anyone else. Ethan believed that losing Titan meant the best part of his life was already behind him. But God often writes a different ending than the one we expect. Sometimes he sends healing in ways that look small at first. A chance meeting, a stranger who becomes a friend, a responsibility that slowly brings meaning back into an empty place in the heart. In this story, that healing arrived on four paws, through the loyalty of Ranger and Scout, through the kindness of Emily, and through the quiet reminder that love always finds its way back to the people who are brave enough to give it again. The truth is that miracles in everyday life rarely look like miracles at the beginning. They look like simple choices. Choosing compassion instead of turning away. Choosing to help when it would be easier to ignore someone in need. Choosing hope even after disappointment. When we take those small steps, God often takes the rest of the journey with us. And just like Ethan discovered, the very thing we rescue may become the thing that rescues us. Maybe someone watching or listening to this story today feels like Ethan once did. Maybe you feel lost or tired, or like your best days are already behind you. But remember this, God is never finished writing your story. Sometimes the next chapter begins with something small that arrives at your door when you least expect it. Stay open to kindness. Stay open to purpose. And never underestimate the quiet ways that grace can enter your life. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, because stories like this remind us that we are never truly alone, no matter where we live. And if you believe that faith, compassion,